but in the stories that would be passed down through generations. Tales of courage and suffering, of victory and defeat, in the endless cycle of war that had shaped this corner of the Mediterranean for millennia. Welcome to Historical Moments, where we take you on a journey through time. Our channel is dedicated to bringing you fascinating stories, pivotal events, and unforgettable moments that have shaped our world. Whether it's a significant battle, a game-changing discovery, or a moment of triumph, we uncover the history that defines us. Subscribe and join us as we explore the past, one moment at a time. The Mediterranean sun beats down on an armada of French ships as they approach the Egyptian coast in the summer of 1798. At their helm stands the ambitious 29-year-old General Napoleon Bonaparte, his eyes fixed on the distant shoreline of Alexandria. This is no ordinary military campaign. It's a bold attempt to strike at Britain's empire by threatening its trade routes to India. 35,000 French soldiers pour onto Egyptian soil, their blue uniforms stark against the desert sand. Napoleon isn't just bringing an army, he's brought 167 scholars, scientists, and artists. This expedition is as much about conquest as it is about discovery. The first major clash comes at the Battle of the Pyramids. The French army forms into squares, their bayonets glinting in the scorching sun. Facing them are 40,000 Mamluk cavalry warriors, feared throughout the Middle East for their fighting prowess. But against modern military tactics and artillery, even the legendary Mamluks fall. Cairo belongs to France, yet while Napoleon conquers on land, disaster strikes at sea. British Admiral Horatio Nelson discovers the French fleet anchored in Acre Bay. In a devastating night battle, Nelson's ships systematically destroy Bonaparte's naval forces, stranding the French army in Egypt. For 3 years, the campaign unfolds across ancient lands. French soldiers discover the Rosetta Stone, scholars document every aspect of Egyptian civilization, and Bonaparte himself adopts local customs to win over the population. But mounting casualties from disease, guerrilla warfare, and Ottoman attacks gradually wear down French resolve. By 1801, the dream of an Egyptian empire lies in ruins. The French army, now under General Manu, surrenders to British and Ottoman forces. Napoleon himself had already slipped away to France 2 years earlier, leaving his army behind to pursue his political ambitions. Yet this military defeat produces an unexpected victory. A cultural revolution. The scholarly works from this campaign ignite European fascination with ancient Egypt, birth the science of Egyptology, and unlock the secrets of hieroglyphics. The Egyptian campaign may have failed as a conquest, but it succeeded in bridging two worlds, forever changing both European and Egyptian society. The scorching Egyptian sun beat down mercilessly on the French soldiers as they marched across the desert sands toward the pyramids of Giza. It was July 21, 1798, and General Napoleon Bonaparte's army of 25,000 men had been traversing this unforgiving landscape for days, their blue uniforms caked with dust, their throats parched from the relentless heat. In the distance, the ancient pyramids rose like mountains against the cloudless sky. But it wasn't the monuments that held Napoleon's attention. His eyes were fixed on the massive force gathering before them. Nearly 40,000 Mamluk warriors, their curved swords glinting in the sunlight, their horses pawing at the sand in anticipation of battle. Napoleon stood atop a small rise, surveying the scene through his spyglass. The Mamluks were an impressive sight, their colorful banners waving in the hot desert wind, their highly trained cavalry renowned throughout the world for their fearsome fighting skills. But Napoleon had a plan. Turning to his men, he delivered words that would echo through history. "Soldiers, from the heights of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you." The French army moved into position, forming massive infantry squares, a tactical innovation that would prove decisive. Each square consisted of 6 ranks of men, with artillery pieces at the corners and cavalry and supplies protected in the middle. From above, the formation would have looked like giant rectangles carved into the desert floor. The Mamluk leader, Murad Bey, watched the French maneuvers with growing concern. His forces were more numerous, and his cavalry was considered superior, but something about the strange French formations gave him pause. Still, he had little choice. The French army threatened Cairo itself, and the Mamluks were Egypt's defenders. As the morning wore on, the heat became even more intense. The air shimmered above the sand, and men on both sides struggled to maintain their composure. The French soldiers, already exhausted from their long march, gripped their muskets with sweaty hands. The Mamluks adjusted their ornate armor, their horses growing increasingly restless. Then, like thunder across the desert, Murad Bey gave the signal. Thousands of Mamluk cavalry charged forward, their horses' hooves throwing up clouds of sand, their warriors brandishing their curved swords and letting out fearsome battle cries. The sound was deafening, a combination of pounding hooves, jangling equipment, and human voices raised in challenge. But Napoleon's squares held firm. As the Mamluk cavalry approached, the French soldiers presented their bayonets outward, creating a bristling wall of steel. At the precise moment, the order was given. Fire! The squares erupted with coordinated volleys of musket fire, cutting down horses and riders with devastating efficiency. The Mamluks' charge broke against the French squares like waves against a cliff. Their traditional tactics, individual acts of heroism and skilled horsemanship, proved useless against the disciplined European formation. Some of the more determined warriors actually rode their horses directly into the French bayonets, sacrificing themselves in desperate attempts to break the squares. The battle became a swirling chaos of dust, smoke, and blood. The French artillery pieces at the corners of each square fired grape-shot into the dense masses of Mamluk cavalry, while the continuous volleys of musket fire prevented any coordinated assault from developing. The desert sand turned red beneath the horses' hooves. Individual acts of bravery abounded on both sides. French soldiers maintained their discipline even as mounted warriors charged within feet of their positions. Mamluk cavalry performed incredible feats of horsemanship, some managing to ride completely around the French squares, searching for any weakness in the formation. But the squares held. As the afternoon wore on, the Mamluk attacks began to lose their fury. The cost had been too high, the losses too great. Murad Bey, seeing his forces decimated without achieving any significant impact on the French positions, finally ordered a retreat. The Battle of the Pyramids, as it would come to be known, lasted only a few hours, but its impact would be felt for generations. The French lost only about 300 men, while the Mamluks suffered thousands of casualties. More significantly, the battle demonstrated the superiority of modern military tactics and organization over traditional warfare methods. Napoleon's army entered Cairo triumphantly the next day, beginning a brief but significant French presence in Egypt. The local population watched in stunned silence as the victorious European army marched through their streets, the same army that had defeated their supposedly invincible Mamluk defenders. The battle marked the effective end of Mamluk military power, a force that had dominated Egypt for centuries. The site of the pyramids, which had witnessed the rise and fall of countless empires, now stood witness to another turning point in history. They had watched as ancient Egyptian pharaohs built their monuments, as Alexander the Great claimed the land, as Arabs and Turks and Mamluks had come and gone. Now they watched as a new power planted its flag in the desert sands. For Napoleon, the victory enhanced his growing reputation as an unbeatable commander. The Battle of the Pyramids became one of his most celebrated victories, immortalized in paintings and literature. Yet even this triumph would prove fleeting. Within weeks, British Admiral Horatio Nelson would destroy the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile, effectively stranding Napoleon's army in Egypt. But on that hot July afternoon, as the sun set behind the pyramids and the last sounds of battle faded away, none of that mattered. The desert wind swept across the battlefield, beginning its work of erasing the day's violence from the sand. The pyramids stood silent as they had for millennia, watching as history unfolded in their shadow, adding one more chapter to their endless story. The Mediterranean sun cast long shadows across the water as Admiral Horatio Nelson's fleet approached the Egyptian coast. It was August 1st, 1798, and after months of searching, they had finally found their prey. Napoleon Bonaparte's French fleet anchored in Aboukir Bay. The French ships lay in a defensive line, their massive forms stretching across the bay like a wall of wooden fortresses. Admiral François-Paul Brueys de Gallier believed his position impregnable, with shallow waters protecting his fleet's flanks. But Nelson saw something his opponent had missed. There was just enough space between the French ships and the shoals for his vessels to slip through. As the sun began to set, Nelson gave the order that would change history. His ships split into two divisions, one sailing between the French line and the shore, the other attacking from the seaward side. The French were caught completely off guard. They had expected an attack the following morning and were unprepared for battle, with many of their guns still facing the wrong direction. The British ship Goliath led the assault, threading the needle between the shoals and the French line. The sound of cannon fire shattered the evening calm as the battle began in earnest. Wooden splinters flew through the air as cannonballs tore into ships' hulls. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air, mixing with the salt spray of the Mediterranean. At the heart of the French line sat the massive L'Orient, a 120-gun ship of the line that dwarfed all others. As night fell, the battle reached its terrible crescendo. British ships pounded the French flagship relentlessly. Shortly after 9 o'clock, fire broke out on L'Orient's deck. The flames spread quickly, racing up the rigging and illuminating the entire bay in a ghostly light. The crew of both fleets watched in horror as the fire reached L'Orient's powder magazine. The resulting explosion was catastrophic. The mighty flagship erupted in a fireball that lit up the night sky like daylight. The blast was so powerful that it shook every ship in the bay, temporarily halting the battle as burning debris rained down on friend and foe alike. When the smoke cleared, the French fleet lay in ruins. Of their 13 ships of the line and 4 frigates, only 2 managed to escape. The rest were either captured, destroyed, or run aground. The French lost around 2,000 men, while British casualties numbered just under 900. The battle continued through the night and into the following day, but the outcome was already decided. Nelson had achieved one of the most decisive naval victories in history. The destruction of the French fleet effectively stranded Napoleon's army in Egypt, dealing a severe blow to French ambitions in the eastern Mediterranean. As dawn broke on August 3rd, the magnitude of the British victory became clear. The bay was littered with wreckage, while captured French vessels flew British colors alongside their victorious captors. Nelson, despite being wounded in the battle, had orchestrated a triumph that would reshape the balance of power in Europe. The Battle of the Nile demonstrated the superiority of British naval tactics and the genius of Nelson's leadership. It marked a turning point in the war against revolutionary France, establishing British dominance of the Mediterranean and isolating Napoleon's forces in Egypt. The victory would be celebrated throughout Britain, and would cement Nelson's reputation as his nation's greatest naval commander. In the years that followed, the battle would be remembered not just for its strategic importance, but for the sheer drama of that August night, when two great fleets clashed in Abukir Bay, and the Mediterranean waters reflected the fires of history in the making. The spring of 1799 found Napoleon Bonaparte's ambitious Egyptian campaign at a crucial crossroads. The French commander stood before the ancient walls of Acre, a fortress city on the Mediterranean coast that had withstood sieges since the time of the Crusades. Acre was more than just another conquered city to Napoleon. It represented the key to his grand vision of an Eastern empire that would rival Alexander the Great's. Behind those weathered walls lay his path to Syria, and beyond that, perhaps even to Constantinople itself. But first, those walls had to fall. What would unfold over the next 2 months would become one of the most dramatic sieges of the age. The scene was set for a battle that would test the limits of strategy, endurance, and ambition. The French army arrived outside Acre on March 19th, their spirits high despite the long march through the desert. Napoleon had good reason for confidence. His forces had already captured Malta, Alexandria, and Cairo. His 13,000 troops were hardened veterans, supported by massive siege guns that could reduce most fortifications to rubble. But Acre would prove different. The city's defenses were commanded by Jezer Pasha, a ruthless Ottoman governor who had earned his nickname, the Butcher. More crucially, the British Royal Navy under Commodore Sir Sidney Smith had arrived just in time to reinforce the garrison. The British brought not just naval guns and supplies, but also military engineers who would prove invaluable in strengthening Acre's defenses. The siege began with French artillery pounding the walls, while sappers dug trenches ever closer to the fortifications. But each breach the French created was rapidly repaired under the direction of French royalist officer Philippot, who had once been Napoleon's classmate and was now working with the British. It was a bitter irony that one of France's own sons was helping to thwart Napoleon's ambitions. The defenders fought with remarkable tenacity. When French troops would breach a section of wall, they would find new barriers erected behind it, turning each potential breakthrough into a killing zone. Ottoman soldiers conducted fierce counterattacks, while British ships provided devastating flanking fire from the harbor. The French soldiers began calling Acre that cursed fortress. By April, disease was spreading through the French camp. The spring rains had turned their trenches into fevered swamps. Napoleon's mighty siege guns had been captured at sea by the British, forcing him to rely on lighter field artillery that proved inadequate against Acre's thick walls. Yet he persisted, knowing that retreat would shatter his dream of Eastern conquest. The fighting reached its crescendo in May. French troops launched assault after assault, sometimes gaining footholds on the walls, only to be driven back with horrible losses. The defenders fought with equal desperation, knowing that if Acre fell, all of Syria might follow. The city's streets ran red with blood as both sides engaged in vicious, close-quarter combat. Napoleon himself seemed possessed by the need to take Acre. He exposed himself to enemy fire, exhorting his men forward, promising glory and riches if they could just break through. But each attack was repulsed, each small gain paid for in French blood. The bodies of fallen soldiers filled the ditches and trenches, creating an overwhelming stench in the spring heat. By mid-May, Napoleon faced a harsh reality. His army had suffered over 2,000 casualties. Plague was rampant in his camp. His ammunition was running low, and news arrived of Turkish armies gathering to threaten his position in Egypt. The dream of an Eastern empire was crumbling before Acre's unyielding walls. On May 20th, after 60 days of siege, Napoleon ordered a retreat. It was his first significant defeat, and one that would haunt him. Years later, he would reflect that if Acre had fallen, I would have changed the face of the world. His army withdrew under cover of darkness, burning their siege equipment and abandoning their wounded to the mercy of their enemies. The consequences of the failed siege reverberated far beyond its immediate aftermath. Napoleon's aura of invincibility was shattered. The Ottoman Empire maintained its grip on Syria. Britain's naval supremacy was reinforced. Most importantly, Napoleon's Oriental ambitions were checked, forcing him to return to France, where his destiny would take a different path. Sir Sidney Smith, the British commander who had done so much to thwart Napoleon, would later say that at Acre, "We had with us the fate of the civilized world." The ancient walls of Acre still stand today, bearing silent witness to those desperate months in 1799. In the end, Napoleon's failure at Acre demonstrates how even small defeats can alter the grand sweep of history. His dream of an Eastern Empire died before those unyielding walls, redirecting his ambitions back toward Europe. The world would never know what might have been had those walls fallen in the spring of 1799. The Mediterranean sun beat down mercilessly on the ancient walls of Jaffa in July 1799. Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the edge of his camp, his keen eyes fixed on the fortified city before him. The siege that would unfold over the next week would become one of the most controversial episodes of his Egyptian campaign, a tale of desperation, brutality, and the harsh realities of war. Just months earlier, Bonaparte's grand vision of conquering the East had begun to crumble. His army, exhausted from the failed siege of Acre, was retreating south along the Palestinian coast. Disease and fatigue had taken their toll, but it was the news that reached them from Jaffa that truly tested their resolve. The garrison they had left behind had fallen to Ottoman forces, and now those same walls that had once sheltered French troops stood as a barrier to their retreat. The siege of Jaffa was not merely a military maneuver, but a critical juncture in Napoleon's desperate campaign to salvage his ambitions in the East. Colonel Jean-Baptiste Kleber wiped the sweat from his brow as he approached Napoleon's tent. The sound of waves crashing against Jaffa's harbor walls mingled with the distant echo of Ottoman cannons. "General," he reported, "our scouts confirm the enemy has reinforced the city. They number perhaps 4,000. Napoleon's response was swift and decisive. The city had to fall, and quickly. His army couldn't risk being caught between the Ottoman forces in Jaffa and those pursuing from the north. The siege began with the familiar, patterned French artillery positioning themselves on the surrounding hills, their cannons trained on Jaffa's ancient walls. Inside the city, Ahmed Pasha, the Ottoman commander, moved through the narrow streets, rallying his defenders. The population, still haunted by the French occupation months earlier, prepared for the worst. Women filled water jugs, knowing that every drop would be precious in the days to come. Children helped gather stones for the defenders, while the elderly prayed in the city's mosques. The first French bombardment began at dawn on July 3rd. The roar of cannons shattered the morning calm, and plumes of smoke rose above the city walls. Napoleon had positioned his best artillery units with precision, targeting the same weak points his forces had exploited in their first assault on the city months earlier. A young French soldier, Pierre Dumont, recorded in his diary, "The walls of Jaffa seemed to weep dust and stone with each impact, yet the defenders show no sign of surrender. They return our fire with determination, though their shots fall short more often than not. We can hear their calls to prayer 5 times a day, carrying across the battlefield like a defiant challenge." As the siege intensified, conditions within Jaffa deteriorated rapidly. The summer heat turned the cramped streets into furnaces, and the shortage of fresh water began to take its toll. The Ottoman defenders, though resolute, could see their situation growing more desperate by the hour. Many had witnessed Napoleon's previous conquest of the city and knew the consequences of prolonged resistance. On July 5th, a breach finally appeared in the southern wall. Napoleon ordered his infantry to prepare for an assault, but the defenders had anticipated this moment. They had transformed the narrow streets behind the breach into a deadly maze of barricades and ambush points. The first French soldiers who entered found themselves in a killing zone. Captain Michel Laurent, who led one of the assault columns, described the scene.
The streets became rivers of fire. Every window, every doorway concealed defenders. We gained ground meter by meter, paying for each step with French blood. The sounds of combat echoed off the ancient stones until it seemed the very city was screaming.
The fighting continued through the night, lit by burning buildings and the flash of musket fire. The defenders fought with the desperate courage of men who expected no quarter, and the French pressed forward with the determination of soldiers who could not afford to fail. By dawn on July 6th, the French had secured a foothold within the walls, but the cost had been heavy. Napoleon, receiving reports of the casualties, knew he needed to end the siege quickly. His army's survival depended on securing Jaffa and continuing their retreat to Egypt. He ordered his artillery to intensify their bombardment of the city center, while his infantry pushed deeper into the maze of streets. The turning point came on July 7th, when a group of local merchants, seeing the inevitable outcome and hoping to spare the city further destruction, approached Ahmed Pasha. They urged him to negotiate a surrender. The Ottoman commander, realizing his position was untenable, finally agreed to parley. Under a flag of truce, Ahmed Pasha met with French representatives in a damaged mosque near the city center. The terms were harsh but simple. The garrison would be allowed to leave with their personal weapons, but the city and all its military supplies would fall to the French. With Ottoman forces from Acre approaching from the north, both sides knew time was of the essence. As the Ottoman garrison marched out of the city on July 8th, Napoleon watched from a hillside position. The French soldiers, exhausted but relieved, began the task of securing the city. The aftermath of the siege revealed its toll. The city's streets were littered with debris and bodies, its walls scarred by cannon fire. French medical officers worked tirelessly to treat the wounded from both sides, while burial details began their grim task. The port, vital to French plans for retreat, had survived largely intact, allowing Napoleon to begin preparations for his army's return to Egypt. A French officer, writing to his family, captured the mood. Jaffa stands, but at what cost? The streets still echo with the sounds of recent battle, and the air carries the scent of powder and death. We have won, but victory tastes of ashes and salt air. The siege of Jaffa marked a crucial moment in Napoleon's Egyptian campaign. Though successful, it highlighted the increasing desperation of his position in the east. The French army had secured its line of retreat, but the cost in lives and resources had been severe. The legacy of the siege would be debated for years to come. Within days, they would resume their march south, leaving behind a garrison in the battered city. The legacy of the siege would be debated for years to come. For the French, it represented both the skill of their army and the increasing futility of their Egyptian adventure. For the Ottomans, it was another harsh lesson in the realities of modern warfare. And for the people of Jaffa, it was yet another chapter in their city's long history of conquest and survival. The walls of Jaffa would be rebuilt, its streets would be cleared, and life would return to its ancient rhythms. But the summer of 1799 had left its mark, not just in the scars on the city's stones, but in the stories that would be passed down through generations. Tales of courage and suffering, of victory and defeat, in the endless cycle of war that had shaped this corner of the Mediterranean for millennia. Thank you for watching Historical Moments. We hope you enjoyed this trip through history. If you liked the video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible stories from the past. Until next time, keep exploring the moments that changed history.